Shabbat Shalom again, everybody. So, one of the things that this pandemic has done for us, amongst so many things, is that it has distilled and clarified some of the major societal problems that we have been dealing with for decades. And by that I mean, we have long had the societal problems of increasing differences between the rich and the poor, between black and white, between those with power and those who are vulnerable and powerless. And if this pandemic has done anything at all, it has only exacerbated these very difficult gaps and polarizations that have happened in our society. If you look at the list of all of the medical conditions that put one at greater risk for the coronavirus, of course, you see things like heart disease, obesity, diabetes. When you link up the data about the incidence of these kind of conditions with the demographics, you begin to see something very stark. You see that the highest incidence of these kind of pre-existing medical conditions happen amongst the poor, the elderly. It happens amongst people who are of color. It happens to people who are in blighted urban areas and who are living in rural areas as well. These are the people who are most likely to die of COVID-19. Now, we have long known, of course, that there is this correlation between those who are less privileged and greater disease and greater incidence of dying at younger ages. But what we're looking at now, of course, is this same tendency to happen now at an exponentially greater rate in our society at this time. It is truly a terrifying thing to see. So the question that I'd like us to think about is, so what do we do about this? Where do we begin even to think about this? And that's why it's so important to look at this growing crisis through Jewish eyes, through the lens of essential Jewish values, core Jewish values. And in fact, maybe this is an opportunity for us to look at some values again in a new light, in light of this pandemic. And the one that I'd like us to look at today is what we call the Jewish value of tzedakah. And I'll explain what I mean in just a moment. In the Parsha, as Gabe explained, we have this teaching about this census and these numberings of all of the tribes of Israel. Interestingly, though, as Gabe also mentioned, one tribe is not numbered together with the other tribes. That, of course, is the tribe of Levi. Lo hitbaku bitocham. You shall not consider them amongst the rest of the tribes. And why is that? Because the tribe of Levi also contained the Kohanim. These are the people who were in service of the temple and the sacred worship. And so they were not landed like the rest of the tribes who had their own land holdings. They did not have their own land, their own real estate upon which to have their own wealth. They were dependent on the contributions of everyone else in Israelite society. And this, of course, made them particularly vulnerable, which is also interesting to see how even within the Torah, it is the tribe of Levi which is regularly associated with other vulnerable populations, like the poor and like the stranger and the widow. Like it says in the book of Deuteronomy, "V'samachta b'chol hatov," you should rejoice in with all the good that God has given you. Ata v'halevi v'hagercha asher b'kirbecha. You and the Levite and the stranger who is amongst you. That's an interesting way of connecting it, that the tribe of Levi is likened to the stranger, even though they're just as Jewish as everybody else, because of this dependency. And so this speaks volumes about the origins of the concept of tzedakah and what we really mean by the idea of tzedakah in Judaism. And I'm going to explain with a midrash. The rabbis of the midrash quote a line from the book of Proverbs, which says, "Al tigzalu dal ki dalhu." Do not steal from the poor because he is poor. Interesting line. And the rabbis of the Midrash asked the question, why would anybody want to steal from the poor? I mean, if you're going to steal from somebody, you might as well steal from somebody who is rich, because you're not going to get anything if you steal from the poor. So the rabbis respond, no, this actually refers to the Levites, who are together with the poor and the vulnerable in society. Even though they are an honored group of the Jewish people, they are there together with the poor and the stranger to teach us an important lesson, that they, just like the poor, must be supported, and you can't steal from them the societal structures that are there to support them, like the gleanings of the field and the corner of your field and the forgotten grains and the tithes for the poor. These are the societal support that everybody in this category needs. It is their right. And the rabbis conclude the Midrash by saying, is it enough that the wealthy can bask in their riches, that they must also take from what is due to the poor? It's a very powerful Midrash and a very powerful way into understanding this Jewish value of tzedakah, that there are those in our society who will always be the more vulnerable, and that they must never be deprived of their essential necessities. They must never be held back from healthcare, from housing, from all of the basic needs of food and everything else that they need. And we are commanded to share what resources we may have so that they have it as well. In other words, the Torah, through this concept of tzedakah, this mitzvah of tzedakah, is stating that the wealth that we may have doesn't inherently belong to us. It is the right of those who are less advantaged to have a part of that as well. Now, this is a value system which is quite alien to us in our modern day American society, because our modern day American society, of course, is based on capitalism. And capitalism, as we all know, teaches you that when you work hard for your own money, that and whatever other resources you have, that money and those resources belong to you and you alone, and it's yours. And the end of the story, it's yours. You earned it, you own it. Very different. And if you are going to support the poor in a capitalist society, it is done as an act of charity. And charity in this concept is something that you can decide to give because out of the goodness of your heart. If you're a good person, you will give, but you are under no absolute obligation to do so. It is simply according to what you feel like giving. This is totally different from the concept of tzedakah. That tzedakah is inherently that everybody is deserving of essential support and needs because everybody is equally created, b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God. That is the essence of even the word tzedakah, tzedek. Tzedek literally means righteousness or justice. Tzedakah is much more than just putting money in the pushki. Tzedakah is an entire way, an entire spiritual orientation with respect to the world, of looking at all of the disparities and inequalities and trying to reset the scales of justice by, yes, using the money that we have, but it's not just about money. It's about our skills and our efforts and our time and whatever else we can to balance the scales of justice in our world in order to get people who do not have jobs, to get them jobs, in order to get people who do not have adequate access to healthcare and housing and essential human dignity. This is really the message of tzedakah, a core value in the Jewish tradition. Now, I want to make something very clear. I'm not saying that those of us who, thank God, have the blessings of comfort and some degree of wealth, and that we have our own possessions that we have worked so hard to achieve, that we are in some way being like the Midrash says, like we're stealing from the poor. We are not ganefs simply because we have resources that others do not have. That is not the message of tzedakah that I am teaching today. What I'm teaching instead is how this message applies to all of society around us. that we are, as the Jewish people, are constantly there to be vigilant to ensure that we are building a society which collectively is not stealing from the poor because they are poor. That we are creating a society itself that understands things that we have long known, that yes, there's disparities, but now, especially in this moment of life and death for so many of the most vulnerable in our society, we must promote the real meaning of the value of tzedakah in our lives, that we must push against the forces of inequality with all of the strength that we have, that we must make sure that access to healthcare and all of essential resources are not impeded anywhere in our society. And that means that we must continually demand of our local and state and federal authorities that they all work together in concert, together to ensure not only that there is adequate testing and contact tracing, but access to essential supplies and healthcare as well, in ways that transcend political difference and cultural divides and ethnic and racial divides. Our failure to do that is not just our own failure, it's the failure of leadership of our society, and it is really our failure as human beings to live up to our potential to be a people of God. So indeed, tzedakah is not just about money. Tzedakah is how we live our lives facing outward and bringing the essential ethical message of Judaism out into the world through our choices, through our actions, through our votes, and through all the things that we can do to ensure that the scales of justice all around us, not just in wealth, but in health and in life itself, are more balanced. May we look forward to the day when we can celebrate truly that we live in a society of tzedakah, of tzedek, of righteousness and true justice. And may we see the day speedily and in good time when all of us may celebrate the access to healthcare, to blessing, and to life. And we all say amen.